Daly.
I think they're before me, in fairness.
You're next on my schedule here, Deputy. Yeah.
Okay. I think, Minister, it is a bit distressing to be here. We go again with our sort of annual ritualised debate about whether or not to retain the emergency powers in the Offences Against the State Act and Section 8 of the Criminal Justice Amendment Act for another year. I mean, it is deeply ironic that they're supposed to be emergencies, but they have become a norm in this country. And every year you tell us, well, the threat is unchanged. It's the same as it was last time. These are exceptional powers and they have to be retained. But given what we've witnessed over the past year even, with the rise in organised crime, is that failure of this legislation to in any way deal with that situation not even evidence enough on its own of how futile it is, not to mind the appalling trampling wholesale on the human rights of individuals for it? Has the penny not dropped, given what's happened here, while you've been utilising this legislation, that a different approach is going to have to be necessary? Now, we have to start with the international human rights institutions, both the United Nations and the Council of Europe, who've repeatedly raised serious questions about the proportionality of Irish emergency powers legislation in this regard, particularly the area of non-jury courts and so on. Too often, really, in Ireland, when we get international human rights reports, be it on crime or abortion or whatever, we feel we're an exception. They are some things that we can ignore. Well, I don't actually think that that's good enough, because human rights are supposed to be universal and applied in all situations. Now, this year, again, we're voting on whether or not to renew these exceptional powers on the heels of one of the most horrendous explosions of violence on the streets of Dublin. And I think, you know, it's been a horrifying few months, but what is striking is how little effect your so-called emergency legislation has had in dealing with these issues. Yet year upon year we're asked to retain this bad law, because, put simply, law and order responses on their own don't work. And us ratifying again these appalling human rights violations is not going to make a single person in Dublin safer in their beds tonight, or indeed in any other part of the country. Because as long as we're following a doomed sort of war on drugs, which is essentially really a licence for crime gangs to print money, facilitating the drugs trade on the one hand and perpetuating disadvantage in parts of our city, well then the problems of crime are inevitably going to be there. We only need to take a look at the north inner city, the area of the latest rounds of violence, where we see huge levels of male unemployment, in some areas 70%, in part 1/3 of the areas are disadvantaged, 10% extremely disadvantaged. And rather than dealing with the issues, we cut funding to vital projects in those areas. And if we really wanted to deal with crime and organised crime, that's where we would start. And if you even take the words of the Lancet Johns Hopkins Commission, hardly a bunch of firebrand radicals, who had this to say in their report on public health in March of this year, when they said policies meant to prohibit or greatly suppress drugs are portrayed and defended vigorously by many policymakers as necessary to preserve public health and safety. And yet, the evidence suggests that they have contributed directly and indirectly to lethal violence, communicable disease transmission, discrimination, forced displacement, unnecessary pain and undermining people's right to health. Drug policy that is dismissive of extensive evidence of its own negative impact and of approaches that could improve health outcomes is bad for all concerned. And they talk about a far more serious approach being one of decriminalising drugs as a gradual move towards regulated drugs markets. That's where we should be if we want to talk about really dealing with crime, not flexing our muscles in terms of law and order and non-human rights compliance provisions which are before us today. Now, obviously, the Special Criminal Court is in part at the heart of some of these emergency powers, repeatedly criticised by the UN Human Rights Committee for its lack of democracy, drawn particular attention by the UN Human Rights Council Special Rapporteur for the Human Rights Defenders, who said that the whole area of this court needed to be carefully monitored, that they were very concerned about the expansion of the recent Special Criminal Court to include organised crime. We know bodies like Amnesty International, the Irish Council for Civil Liberties and so on have repeatedly criticised this human rights violation. I think there are a number of very worrying aspects to it. The fact that the Special Criminal Court has jurisdiction over both scheduled and non-scheduled offences is a particular problem in my opinion. I mean, it might be a little bit dramatic, but what we're posing here in front of us is a provision where basically somebody could be scooped up, arrested, charged with basically anything at all, have the DPP decide on whether to send them by trial by a non-jury with really no obligation to explain why, where they can be tried and convicted by judges who are essentially unaccountable. Now, that might be a bit exaggerated, but that is the reality around some of these courts, and the justification that it's to do with jury intimidation is absolutely laughable, because we know there are ways of dealing with this without the jury being present, being watching on closed-circuit TV, anonymising juries and so on. But even if you weren't willing to do that, the problem with the blanket ban on juries, why isn't it even looked at as it is, say, in the UK, where the possibility of jury tampering has to be, and the risk has to be evaluated first, rather than a blanket ban and a presumption of intimidation in that regard. And in those cases, that violation of human rights can only be done if other reasonable steps, preventative steps like police protection and so on, cannot stand up. And I think we should be looking at these systems, and if you were really worried about protecting juries and so on, then that is what you would be looking at, because we can't ignore the reality that at the moment, tonight for example, a young person, Donal O'Custola, has spending another night in Portlaoise prison, having been there now for over a year. Donal was arrested on the 13th of May and charged with membership of an illegal organisation, along with other charges which have never really been made clear to him. Before he was arrested, he's never been charged with anything, never been involved in violent behaviour or anything like that. Before he was arrested, he was working full-time, finished college the previous year, no convictions, nothing like that. But because of the category with which he was charged, he will face trial in the Special Criminal Court. He can't get bail, and it's likely that he will spend 2 to 3 years in prison before he will even be brought to a non-jury trial. Now, I don't want to live in a society that has that type of repressive legislation, because it doesn't work apart from violating human rights. And I find it utterly reprehensible that not only are you doing this, but you don't need to do it. Not only because it's ineffective, but because you have other alternatives. And I don't know why the Minister hasn't, for example, if you're really serious about dealing with organised crime, why haven't you dealt with and initiated the Criminal Justice Joint Investigations Team Act, which has been on the statute books since 2004. And this gives the power to the Garda Commissioner to ask another EU country to establish a joint investigation team with another European jurisdiction, but you've never done it. Why aren't you linking up with the Spanish authorities in that regard, given that crime is global, and initiating this JIT provision that's already there, rather than asking us to ignore human rights considerations and again nod through repressive legislation which does violate human rights and, sickeningly of all, doesn't actually work. And I think it is appalling that we're being asked to do that in the absence of other legislation on the statute books being invoked, but more particularly when we have a discussion about crime and the drugs industry being at the heart of that, and we're failing to deal with issues about the criminalisation of drugs, that whole market which has been left to people to profit from, which is one of such of the key motivators of crime and violence in this city.
Deputy, thank you.